Anthony Spilotro was born in Chicago in 1938, and like so many stories of that time, his life began in the thick of immigrant struggle. His parents were from Italy, Southern stock, hard-working, devoutly Catholic, and determined to carve out a life in America, even if it meant long days with little reward. His father, Pasquale, ran a small Italian restaurant on the west side of Chicago, and it wasn't just a place for food, it was a gathering spot. Men came in for pasta, yes, but also for conversation, whispers, and sometimes shady handshakes that lasted a little too long. Picture it, red and white checkered tablecloths, the constant smell of tomato sauce and garlic in the air, the clink of glasses in a back room where the men sometimes lingered late after hours. Anthony grew up in this world, watching. He was one of 6 brothers, part of a loud household where elbows bumped at the dinner table, where boys wrestled in the hallways, and where toughness wasn't a choice but a survival tool. School never meant much to Tony. He was restless, hot-blooded, the kind of kid who felt like rules were made for other people. Teachers called him a distraction, a troublemaker. What they didn't understand was that Tony had already been absorbing lessons outside the classroom, lessons about power, loyalty, and survival that no chalkboard could ever provide. He wasn't born for books, he was born for the street. By the time he was in his teens, Chicago was already sharpening him. The city in the 1950s was a beast, divided into neighborhoods, each with its own flavor, its own dangers. On the west side, if you were Italian, you looked out for your own. If you didn't, someone else would take advantage of you. And Tony wasn't about to let anyone make him a victim. He started small. Petty theft, shoplifting, fistfights on corners, the kind of stuff that, in another life, might have landed him in reform school for a few months before fading into adulthood. But Spilotro had something else. He had a temper that made him feared, and a stubbornness that made him impossible to control. He was short, stocky, with a low center of gravity that gave him the look of a bull ready to charge. That earned him a nickname early on, the Ant. He hated it at first, but the streets made it stick. Short or not, he had a reputation for biting down and never letting go. His circle of friends wasn't exactly choir boys either. One of them was Frank Collada, another Chicago kid who would later follow Spilotro all the way to Las Vegas and become part of his infamous hole-in-the-wall gang. Back then, they were just young punks running scams, rolling drunks, breaking into stores. But even in those days, Spilotro stood out. While others fought for the thrill of it, he seemed to fight with purpose, with a kind of cold rage that made him dangerous even when he was barely out of boyhood. The Chicago outfit, the mob, noticed kids like that. Back then, the outfit ran the city like a shadow government. They had their hands in everything: gambling, loan sharking, unions, even politics. If you wanted to open a bar, you paid them. If you wanted protection, they sold it to you. And if you crossed them, you paid a different kind of price. The outfit had a way of keeping its eyes on the street, and sooner or later, their gaze fell on Spilotro. He was just a teenager when he first started working small errands for them. Nothing major at first, carrying messages, running packages, the kind of jobs that tested loyalty without too much risk. But even in these early moments, Tony had a way of proving himself. He wasn't afraid of blood. He wasn't afraid of consequences. That kind of fearlessness, or recklessness depending on how you looked at it, made him valuable. Chicago was full of tough kids, but not all of them had the stomach to take things further. Tony did. There's a story told from those days. One night when he was still just a young punk, Tony got into it with another boy outside a bar. The fight turned ugly fast. Most kids would have thrown a few punches and walked away. Tony didn't walk away. He beat the other boy so badly the cops were called. To them, it was just another neighborhood brawl. But to the outfit, it was proof that this kid had the kind of ruthless edge they could use. By the time he hit his 20s, Spilotro wasn't just another street tough. He was climbing into the lower rungs of the mob ladder. He became an enforcer, the kind of guy you sent to remind someone about a debt, or to make sure a rival kept his mouth shut. His size didn't matter. What mattered was his reputation for violence, and that reputation grew fast. But let's pause here for a moment. It's easy to picture him already as the monster Joe Pesci brought to life in Casino. Explosive, sadistic, unpredictable. But in these years, Tony wasn't yet the king of Vegas. He was still a neighborhood guy, still tied to his brothers, still finding his footing. And that makes this part of his life important. It shows how ordinary his beginnings were. He wasn't born with money, he wasn't born with power. He was born into a cramped Italian home above a restaurant and carved his way into history with his fists and his rage. The Spilotro brothers, all 6 of them, had their own paths. Some stayed closer to legitimate work, helping their father. Others drifted toward the life. But none of them would carry the infamy that Anthony did. He became the one who couldn't be controlled, the one who leaned hardest into the shadows. In those days, Chicago's West Side had a rhythm of its own. Streetcars rattled down the avenues, corner stores sold cigarettes for pennies, and the bars never seemed to close. At night, neon signs buzzed above taverns, and the air carried the mix of cigar smoke and fried food. Young Tony learned every back alley, every shortcut, every face. He knew who to trust and who to watch out for. That knowledge was survival. What set him apart, though, was his hunger. He wanted more than just to scrape by. He wanted power. He wanted respect. And deep down, he wanted fear. Fear was the real currency on the street. Money came and went, but if people feared you, they never forgot. And Tony made sure they feared him. By the early 1960s, he was fully in the outfits world. The bosses saw him as a tool, a blunt instrument for jobs that required muscle and intimidation. He wasn't yet the man pulling strings, but he was the man they sent when strings needed cutting. This was the foundation. The boy from the cramped restaurant home, the restless student, the street brawler, he was transforming into something else, something darker. The ant was beginning to crawl out of the cracks of Chicago's underworld, and soon he'd find himself sent west to the city of neon and desert heat, Las Vegas. But before that, Chicago shaped him. Chicago hardened him. Chicago gave him his teeth. And in the quiet hours of those nights, when the taverns emptied and the sidewalks were slick with rain, you can imagine him walking home, short, stocky, head down, fists still aching from a fight, already carrying the weight of a future he didn't yet see. A future soaked in blood, fear, and the false glitter of casino lights. Chicago in the early 1960s was a city living under 2 governments. On one side, you had City Hall, politicians, cops, aldermen, judges. On the other, you had the outfit. And in many ways, the outfit held more sway. Judges could be bought, cops could be bribed, politicians could be leaned on. If you ran gambling or vice in Chicago, you answered not to the mayor, but to the mob. This was the environment Tony Spilotro cut his teeth in. For every shiny downtown building with brass doors and respectable tenants, there were dozens of back rooms, gambling dens, and social clubs where the real rules were written. Tony wasn't a big man in this world, not yet, but he was climbing, step by step, with fists and fear as his ladder. He had one quality that made him stand out from 100 other young toughs. He didn't bluff. When the outfit gave him an order, he carried it out, brutally, efficiently, without hesitation. That kind of obedience didn't just earn respect, it made him indispensable. Back then, the bosses were men like Mad Sam DeStefano, one of the most vicious killers Chicago ever produced. Mad Sam wasn't just feared, he was hated, even by his own associates. He tortured people for fun. Ice picks, blowtorches, pliers. Most men around him kept their distance. But young Spilotro, he studied him. He learned. Tony wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake the way DeStefano did. But he understood the power of cruelty, the way it bent people to your will. Violence wasn't just punishment, it was a language, and Tony spoke it fluently. Stories spread in Chicago. If you borrowed money and didn't pay it back, Tony might show up at your door. If you thought you could skim from the outfit's operations, Tony might be waiting in the alley. He wasn't the man making deals in fancy suits. He was the man who reminded you those deals weren't optional. By the mid-1960s, he had already built a file with the police. They knew his face, his name, his record, assaults, robberies, a suspected role in murders, though nothing they could prove. He became the kind of man who walked into a bar and silenced the room, not because he was loud, but because everyone knew his reputation. It wasn't just the streets that took notice. Higher-ups in the outfit began testing him with bigger jobs. One of the most important moments in Spilotro's Chicago years came when he was linked to the murder of Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia, two petty thieves who made the fatal mistake of crossing the outfit. McCarthy and Miraglia, later known in the papers as the M&M Boys, were nobodies. Street-level guys trying to make quick money. But they robbed the wrong tavern, one connected to the outfit. That kind of disrespect couldn't go unanswered. The bosses wanted to make an example of them, and Tony Spilotro, by then in his late 20s, was part of the team sent to handle it. What happened next was brutal, even by mob standards. McCarthy was tortured before being killed. They shoved his head into a vise, slowly tightening until his eye popped out. It was a message, plain and simple. You don't cross the outfit. Spilotro's exact role is debated. Some say he turned the handle, others that he stood watch. But his name was forever tied to the legend of that killing. That reputation followed him like a shadow. It marked him as a man capable of handling extreme violence without losing his nerve. It also marked him as someone the bosses could trust with sensitive business. But here's the thing about Chicago. As powerful as the outfit was, the city was crowded. Too many bosses, too many soldiers, too much heat from cops and the FBI. There was only so far a young enforcer could climb before hitting a ceiling. If you wanted to rise higher, you needed fresh territory. And around this time, the outfit had its eyes on one place in particular, Las Vegas. Vegas in the 1960s was booming. The desert city was a neon oasis, casinos sprouting along the strip like glowing temples. But beneath the glitz, the mob's fingerprints were everywhere. Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland, all the big families had their cut of the action. Money poured in from gambling, skimmed off the top before it ever hit the counting rooms. It was the kind of racket every mobster dreamed of. Endless cash, little oversight. The problem was keeping control. Vegas wasn't Chicago. It wasn't New York. It was wide open, a magnet for hustlers, cheaters, and thieves. The outfit needed someone ruthless enough to protect their interests, someone who could sniff out trouble and snuff it out before it grew. Enter Tony Spilotro. By the late 1960s, his Chicago years had made him infamous. He was short, stocky, aggressive, with a stare that seemed to cut right through people. He wasn't flashy, not yet, but he had what Vegas required, a reputation for handling problems without hesitation. Before they sent him west, though, Tony deepened his network in Chicago. He married Nancy Stewart in 1960, a young woman from the neighborhood. Outwardly, it gave him a touch of normalcy. Wife, home, family dinners. But his life was never built for domestic calm. The streets kept calling him, and Nancy would later admit she lived half in fear, half in denial about what her husband really did. It was also during these years that Tony grew closer to Frank Rosenthal, a Chicago bookie with a genius for gambling operations. Rosenthal was the brains, Spilotro was the muscle. The two would later become the infamous pair who ran Las Vegas, Rosenthal handling the casinos, Spilotro enforcing with fists and fire. But that was still ahead. For now, Chicago remained his training ground. He ran with men who robbed jewelry stores, shook down union bosses, and kept bookies in line. He also learned the art of burglary, not just the smash and grab kind, but the careful, professional kind. This skill would serve him later in Vegas, where his hole-in-the-wall gang made headlines for breaking into homes and businesses with surgical precision. By the end of the 1960s, though, Spilotro's future was sealed. Chicago could no longer contain him. His reputation had grown too large, his ambition too restless. The bosses made the call. Tony the Ant was headed west. He would be their man in Las Vegas, their enforcer in the desert, the shadow behind the neon. Imagine him boarding that plane for the first time, leaving behind the smoky bars and gray skies of Chicago for the blinding sun and endless night of Nevada. He wasn't going there to gamble. He wasn't going there to relax. He was going there to rule. But as we'll see, ruling Vegas came at a price. The desert had its own rules, and in time, even the ant would learn that not even the toughest enforcer could fight forever against greed, betrayal, and the relentless eye of law enforcement. When Anthony Spilotro first set foot in Las Vegas in the early 1970s, the city was alive in a way Chicago never could be. Chicago had smoke-filled bars, narrow streets, and cold winds off the lake. Vegas had neon skies, dry desert air, and casinos that never slept. If Chicago was a dark backroom deal, Vegas was a stage lit up for the world to see. To most visitors, the city was a playground. Tourists came for the slots, the shows, the illusion that you could strike it rich overnight. But to the outfit, Vegas wasn't about illusion. It was about extraction. The money pouring through the casinos wasn't just for gamblers. It was for the mob. They skimmed off the top, cash that never got reported, never saw the books, and flowed straight back to Chicago, Kansas City, and Cleveland. And now, Tony was here to make sure that river of money flowed without interruption. His official role looked harmless enough. On paper, Spilotro was a restaurateur. He even opened a jewelry store, the Gold Rush, with his wife Nancy. But that was just a front. Everyone in the know understood why he'd come. He wasn't there to sell watches. He was there to protect Frank Rosenthal. Rosenthal had already made a name as a betting genius, a man who could turn odds into profit with surgical precision. In Vegas, he became the outfit's hidden weapon, running casinos without even holding a gaming license. He managed the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. Rosenthal made the money flow. Spilotro made sure no one dared disrupt it. The two men couldn't have been more different. Rosenthal was cerebral, calculating, almost cold in his logic. He was the kind of man who could sit for hours studying betting lines, crunching numbers, and adjusting odds until he found the tiniest edge. Spilotro was hot-blooded, short-tempered, a man of action. Rosenthal lived in the world of margins. Spilotro lived in the world of fear. Together, they were perfect. Tony began building his reputation in Vegas the same way he had in Chicago, through intimidation. If someone was skimming from a casino, Tony found them. If a cheater tried to beat the tables, Tony's crew handled it. And when I say handled, I don't mean a stern talking to. I mean hospital beds, broken bones, sometimes worse. One of the most infamous stories from this period involved a gambler caught cheating at blackjack. Tony and his men dragged him into a back room, where they put his head in a vise, tightening it until the man screamed. They didn't kill him. This wasn't about death. It was about sending a message. When Tony Spilotro ran security, cheating wasn't just a bad idea. It was suicidal. Word spread fast on the Strip. Spilotro was the outfit's man in Vegas, and his nickname, the Ant, took on new meaning in the desert. Short, yes, but relentless. Small, but deadly. Once he was on you, he didn't let go. But Tony wasn't content just being the mob's watchdog. Vegas had opportunities, too many to ignore. By the mid-1970s, he began building his own operation on the side. It started with burglary. Tony recruited a crew of thieves, many from Chicago, including his old friend Frank Collada. Together, they formed what became known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang. Their specialty was breaking into homes and businesses by literally cutting holes in walls or ceilings to avoid alarms. Jewelry, cash, anything of value, they took it. Vegas was full of rich marks, and the crew fed off them like wolves. The robberies weren't just about money, they were about control. The more jobs Tony pulled, the more his power grew. Soon, he wasn't just enforcing for Rosenthal. He was running his own side empire of burglary, extortion, and loan sharking. And that's where the cracks began to show. The outfit wanted discipline in Vegas. They wanted the money to flow quietly, smoothly, without drawing heat. But Spilotro wasn't quiet. His burglaries made headlines. His violence spilled into public view. He brought too much attention. Still, in those early years, Tony felt untouchable. He had the casinos behind him, his gang beside him, and the fear of the city in his shadow. When he walked into a room, men lowered their eyes. When he sat in a casino lounge, people moved out of his way. Vegas had plenty of tough guys, but Tony was different. He carried Chicago with him, the ruthlessness, the readiness for blood. Even his appearance added to the menace. He wasn't tall, only about 5'5", but he was stocky, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to watch everything at once. He dressed well, but not gaudy. Tailored suits, gold jewelry, always a hint of flash without crossing into cartoonish. If Rosenthal was the polished face, Tony was the muscle you didn't mistake for anything else. The casinos, meanwhile, hummed with energy. Picture the stardust in the 1970s, bright lights pouring out into the desert night, dealers calling bets, cocktail waitresses weaving through clouds of cigarette smoke. Tourists saw glamour. Tony saw business. He knew which tables were hot, which customers were problems, and which employees needed reminding about loyalty. His presence was everywhere, felt even when unseen. And yet, beneath the control, trouble brewed. Law enforcement was watching. The FBI had long suspected mob influence in Vegas, and Spilotro's arrival only sharpened their focus. Agents tracked him, photographed him, built files thick with names and dates. The more violent Tony became, the more attention he attracted. But if the feds were closing in, Tony didn't show fear. He moved through Vegas with confidence, almost arrogance. He bought houses, threw parties, expanded his reach, and he began an affair that would ignite one of the ugliest feuds in mob history. Gary Rosenthal, Frank Rosenthal's wife, was glamorous, blonde, and troubled. She loved the lifestyle, the jewelry, the excitement, but she was unstable, drinking heavily, using pills. Somewhere along the way, she and Tony started an affair. To outsiders, it looked reckless. To insiders, it was suicidal. You didn't touch another mob man's wife, especially not a partner's. But Tony did. He thought he could manage it, thought he could have power, money, and forbidden love all at once. That choice would plant the seeds of his downfall. But in the mid-1970s, Tony wasn't thinking about downfall, he was thinking about domination. By now, his hole-in-the-wall gang was thriving. They broke into jewelry stores, pawn shops, and private homes. They fenced the goods through Tony's own jewelry shop, blending stolen watches and diamonds with legitimate sales. It was the perfect loop: steal it, sell it, launder it, profit. He also extended his influence into loan sharking. Vegas was full of desperate gamblers, men who blew through fortunes at the tables. Tony offered them cash at a price, interest so high it was almost a death sentence. If they didn't pay, he collected. And his collections weren't polite. A beating here, a broken arm there, sometimes worse. The desert became a graveyard for those who crossed him. Out past the glittering strip, where the city lights gave way to endless sand, holes were dug, bodies buried. The tourists never saw it, but the locals whispered about it. Everyone knew if you disappeared in Vegas, chances were good. Tony the Ant had something to do with it. By the late 1970s, Tony had transformed. He was no longer just Chicago's man in Vegas. He was Vegas's monster. His power stretched from casino floors to quiet neighborhoods, from high rollers to street hustlers. His violence was legend, his name spoken with a mix of fear and grudging respect. But as always with men like him, the higher he climbed, the closer he came to the fall. The FBI watched. The outfit grew uneasy with his recklessness. His affair with Gary Rosenthal poisoned his bond with Frank. And the hole-in-the-wall gang, for all its success, left a trail too obvious to hide forever. Still, in those years, before the walls closed in, Spilotro ruled his desert kingdom with iron fists and cold eyes. When the neon lights glowed against the night sky, when dice tumbled across green felt, when champagne flowed in showrooms somewhere in the background, Tony the Ant was watching. Short, sharp, dangerous, a Chicago street brawler turned Las Vegas enforcer. And for a time, he looked unstoppable. By the late 1970s, Las Vegas had changed. and so had Anthony Spilotro. The little desert town that once looked like a neon carnival was now sprawling, casinos multiplying, suburbs pushing into the sand. The money kept rolling in. Millions skimmed from the Stardust and other mob-run joints, all funneled back to Chicago and Kansas City. But while the outfit still pulled strings from afar, in Vegas, the name everyone whispered was Tony the Ant. He was everywhere. His hole-in-the-wall gang was pulling off burglaries like clockwork. His jewelry shop, the Gold Rush, doubled as a clearinghouse for stolen goods. Loan-sharking profits piled up. And his role as protector of Frank Rosenthal meant every casino boss, pit boss, and high roller knew he had the final say in disputes. Tony walked through casinos like he owned them. He'd stand by a blackjack table, his thick hands folded, his dark eyes scanning dealers and players. A nod from him could get a cheater dragged out back. A word in someone's ear could change the odds of survival for a man in debt. People learned quickly. Vegas had lights, but its shadows belonged to Spilotro. But with power came exposure. The FBI had been circling Vegas for years, trying to crack the mob's grip on the casinos. Tony's growing notoriety made him their prime target. They tapped phones, followed cars, took photographs from across the street. FBI agents joked that Spilotro practically ran his operations in the open, daring them to stop him. In truth, Tony wasn't reckless in the way outsiders thought. He was calculating, careful to keep his hands one step removed from many crimes. But he had a fatal flaw. He couldn't resist expanding. The hole-in-the-wall gang became notorious. At first, their burglaries were quiet, precise, almost surgical. But greed has a way of making men sloppy. Jobs grew bigger, riskier. By 1980, Las Vegas newspapers were filled with headlines about a wave of break-ins. Citizens whispered about alarms that didn't matter, safes that weren't safe, police that never caught the culprits. Everyone knew the gang's name, and everyone knew who ran it. The FBI noticed too. Their files on Spilotro grew thick, full of photographs, witness statements, taped conversations. They gave him a code name in their investigations, Tony the Ant, mocking his size but not his danger. Even within the outfit, questions began. Back in Chicago, the bosses liked money, not headlines. They wanted Vegas to stay quiet, smooth, reliable. Tony's violence, his burglaries, his rising profile, it all drew too much heat. And then came the personal betrayal that turned friends into enemies. Tony's affair with Gary Rosenthal was no longer rumor. Frank Rosenthal, cool, calculating Frank, knew his wife was slipping into Tony's arms. For a man like Frank, humiliation was worse than violence. He needed Tony's muscle, but he despised him for crossing the line. Their partnership, once balanced between brain and brawn, began to rot from within. Meanwhile, Tony's marriage to Nancy was crumbling. His life was a whirl of late nights, side deals, and violence. Nancy stayed, raised their children, but the distance grew. She later admitted she lived in fear, not just of Tony's temper, but of the men who surrounded him. The house always carried tension, like a wire stretched too tight. Through it all, Tony kept expanding. He wanted more than just Vegas burglaries. He dreamed of running the desert like his personal kingdom. And that ambition made him careless. One night in 1981, the hole-in-the-wall gang planned a job that would become infamous, the burglary of Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings, a Las Vegas jewelry store. It was supposed to be just another heist. The gang drilled into the roof, planning to drop down and clean the place out. But this time, law enforcement was waiting. The police had been tipped off. As Tony's men cut their way inside, officers swarmed the building. Arrests were made, charges filed. For the first time, the gang that had seemed untouchable was exposed. Tony himself wasn't inside the store. He rarely was on jobs. But everyone knew the crew worked for him. The arrests gave the FBI leverage. Some of his closest associates, like Frank Collada, began to crack under pressure. Collada, once Tony's childhood friend, eventually flipped and testified against him. It was betrayal at the deepest level, the kind of betrayal Tony had always dished out, now returned to him. But even before Collada flipped, Tony felt the walls closing in. He grew paranoid, suspicious of everyone around him. He accused men of being informants, sometimes beating them, sometimes worse. His temper, always volatile, became explosive. The outfit noticed. From Chicago's point of view, Tony had become a liability. The Vegas skim was too valuable to risk, and Tony's chaos threatened it all. The bosses started whispering about whether their aunt had crawled too far out of line. Yet in those days, before the fall, Tony still strutted like a king. He spent his nights in casinos, his days at the jewelry store or with his gang. He carried himself like a man untouchable, even as the FBI shadowed his every move. The desert around Vegas told another story. Out beyond the Strip, in quiet stretches of sand and scrub, shallow graves multiplied. Men who had crossed Tony, men suspected of betrayal, men who owed too much, many of them vanished into those lonely places. The desert kept secrets, but law enforcement kept records. Each disappearance added weight to the case against him. By the early 1980s, Tony's name was synonymous with fear in Las Vegas. For gamblers, he was the shadow behind the dice. For hustlers, he was the man who decided life or death. For law enforcement, he was the embodiment of mob control. And for the outfit, he was becoming too loud, too hot, too dangerous. The irony was sharp. Tony had come to Vegas to keep the skim quiet, to be the enforcer who protected the outfit's golden goose. Instead, he had turned himself into the story. He had wanted power, and he got it. But power in Vegas was never permanent, because in the mob, the same men who lift you up are the ones who can bury you. And the decision about Tony the Ant's future was beginning to shift from loyalty to survival. The summer of 1981 was a turning point for Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro. The arrest of his hole-in-the-wall gang during the Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings burglary was more than just a bad job gone wrong. It was a spotlight. It was the kind of blunder that dragged everything Tony had built into the open. For years, he had managed to keep one foot in the shadows. People whispered his name, feared him, blamed him for burglaries and disappearances, but hard evidence had always been thin. He wasn't the man cracking safes, he was the man giving orders. But Bertha's changed that. His men were caught in the act, and when the arrests hit the newspapers, the words "Hole in the Wall Gang" and "Tony Spilotro" were plastered together for everyone to see. The FBI could smell blood. Tony, for all his swagger, knew the danger. The outfit wanted Vegas quiet, no headlines, no cops sniffing around. But now the whole city was buzzing about his crew. For Chicago, that kind of heat was unacceptable. Worse, inside the gang itself, trust was crumbling. Frank Collada, Tony's boyhood friend, his loyal soldier since Chicago, was facing prison time after Bertha's. And the FBI saw their chance. They leaned on him hard, offering deals, threatening long sentences. Collada had lived the life for decades, but even the toughest men have limits. With the weight of prison on his shoulders and Tony's paranoia already making him fear for his life, Collada flipped. It was betrayal, pure and simple. Collada agreed to testify against Tony, to spill everything he knew about the burglaries, the murders, the extortions. For the FBI, it was gold. For Tony, it was a knife in the back. When word reached Spilotro that Collada had turned, he raged. The Ant had always built his empire on loyalty enforced by fear. But when a man who'd grown up with him, who'd sat at his tables and followed him into jobs, decided to switch sides, it rattled him. Still, Tony tried to act unfazed. He kept showing his face in casinos, still dressed sharp, still speaking with the confidence of a man untouchable. But behind the scenes, paranoia gnawed at him. He began accusing others of being informants. Associates who had once been close suddenly found themselves frozen out, or worse, on the receiving end of his violent suspicions. The FBI, meanwhile, had never been closer. With Collada's testimony, they had details about how the hole-in-the-wall gang operated, where the stolen goods went, even whispers about murders buried in the desert. Cases were built, indictments prepared. Agents followed Tony everywhere, snapping photos of him with Rosenthal, with his crew, with politicians and casino figures. The Ant was under a magnifying glass. And As if the law wasn't enough, his personal life was unraveling. His marriage to Nancy had been strained for years, and now it was fractured beyond repair. The long nights, the affairs, the violence, it all came home in quiet, corrosive ways. Nancy began distancing herself, protecting the children from the chaos that seemed to swirl tighter around their father every year. The Spilotro home was no longer a refuge. It was another battlefield. And then there was Gary Rosenthal. Tony's affair with her, reckless as it was, didn't stop. Gary was spiraling. Alcohol, pills, arguments with Frank. She leaned on Tony for comfort, and he, driven by desire and ego, kept the relationship alive even though it threatened everything. Frank Rosenthal, the man whose casinos Tony was supposed to protect, seethed. Their partnership had been forged in profit, but now it was poisoned by betrayal. Tony, who prided himself on being untouchable, had violated one of the most sacred rules of the life. You don't touch another man's wife, especially not one inside the outfit's business. The tension between the two men grew palpable. In public, they still appeared side by side at times, Rosenthal running the numbers, Spilotro guarding the skin. But behind closed doors, their relationship was fractured, brittle, waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, Tony's ambitions hadn't cooled. If anything, the heat only made him push harder. He wanted more jobs, more burglaries, more influence. He wanted to run Vegas not just as an enforcer, but as a king. And that ambition blinded him to the fact that he was already overextended, already in the crosshairs of too many enemies. Chicago noticed. Back in the Midwest, the outfit bosses had been patient with Tony. They'd tolerated his burglaries, his violence, even his notoriety, because the skim kept flowing. But after Bertha's, after the FBI raids, after the headlines and Collada's betrayal, patience ran thin. To them, Spilotro wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a liability. And in the mob, liabilities don't live long, yet for all the storm clouds gathering, Tony carried on like a man in denial. He still strolled through the stardust. He still barked orders to his gang. He still wore his tailored suits and gold jewelry, as though image alone could shield him from the truth. But the cracks showed in small moments. He snapped quicker at associates. He demanded constant reassurances of loyalty. He grew obsessed with rumors of informants. Men whispered that Tony was losing his edge, that the paranoia was eating him alive. And the FBI? They watched it all. Every arrest, every betrayal, every strained relationship only tightened their grip. Agents began to see Spilotro not as a predator, but as prey. A man boxed in by his own choices, too arrogant to admit it, too violent to walk away. By 1983, the story of Tony the Ant was no longer one of unchecked power. It was a story of pressure from the law, from the outfit, from his own reckless decisions. The man who had once ruled Vegas's shadows was now stumbling under the weight of them. But the thing about Spilotro was this: even as his world collapsed, he never backed down. He didn't flee. He didn't go underground. He kept walking the casino floors, kept running his rackets, kept acting like the king he wanted to be. It was that stubbornness, some would call it courage, others stupidity, that defined him. He had risen on fear, on brutality, on the refusal to bend. And now, even as the walls closed in, he refused to bow. For a while longer, he clung to power. But everyone in Vegas, from FBI agents to outfit bosses, knew the same thing. The Ant's time was running out. By 1983, Las Vegas no longer belonged to Anthony Spilotro the way it once had. He still walked the casino floors. He still flashed his jewelry and his grin. He still carried himself like the man no one dared cross. But under the surface, the empire was crumbling. The FBI had infiltrated his world with wiretaps, informants, and undercover agents. His hole-in-the-wall gang had been gutted after the Bertha's bust and Collada's betrayal. His marriage was cold. His affair with Gary Rosenthal had poisoned his alliance with Frank. And back in Chicago, bosses were muttering about whether the Ant had outlived his usefulness. But Tony wasn't the kind of man who retreated. He doubled down. He still kept his hands in burglaries, robberies, and loan sharking. Even when casinos banned him, Nevada authorities had blacklisted him from entering licensed gambling halls. He found ways to lurk on the edges. He'd send associates inside to watch games, to spot cheaters, to make sure money flowed where it was supposed to. If the law thought they could bar him from his kingdom with a piece of paper, Tony laughed in their faces, but the laughter rang hollow. Everyone could see it. He was being squeezed. The hole-in-the-wall gang limped along, but without Collada's loyalty, without the discipline that once made them effective, they turned sloppy. Jobs failed. Arrests piled up. Some members scattered. Some tried to cut deals for themselves. The gang's name, once feared, became a punchline in police stations and FBI offices. For Tony, it was humiliation. He'd built his reputation on being untouchable, the man who never let go. Now his crew was a wreck, his allies were gone, and his enemies were circling like vultures. And yet, he still had a fire inside him. Violence was his answer to everything. If someone whispered against him, he made them pay. If someone owed money, he pressed harder. He couldn't soften, couldn't change his ways. In the mob world, respect was earned through fear, and Tony couldn't imagine living without it. But that very violence, the thing that had carried him from Chicago alleys to Vegas casinos, was the same thing that dragged him down. The FBI compiled lists of disappearances, beatings, unsolved murders, names of men who had last been seen near Tony's crew. Some bodies surfaced in the desert, others never did. Each case built the picture of a man who ruled with blood. And the outfit, an organization that thrived on control and secrecy, couldn't ignore the attention he brought anymore. Back in Chicago, the bosses were restless. They remembered what Vegas was supposed to be, a river of clean money, skimmed quietly from casinos and sent back east. Tony had turned it into a spectacle. The burglaries, the headlines, the affair with Rosenthal's wife, the endless FBI files. He was poison to the golden goose. Meetings were held, conversations whispered in corners. Men who once praised Tony now shook their heads. The ant had lost his place. But Tony didn't see it, or maybe he refused to. He strutted on, convinced that his reputation, his years of service, his willingness to get his hands dirty would protect him. He'd survived so much already. Fistfights, police raids, betrayals. Why not this? Yet there was a difference now. In the past, the outfit needed him. In 1984 and 1985, they didn't. Casinos were changing. Federal pressure was relentless. Vegas was evolving into something less mob-run, more corporate. The days of Chicago's men skimming millions undetected were ending. And with them, Tony's purpose ended too. Even Frank Rosenthal, once his closest partner, had cooled. Their relationship never recovered from the betrayal with Gary. Frank ran his casinos with icy focus, while Tony grew more erratic, more desperate. The brains and the muscle had split, leaving each man exposed in different ways. Tony's behavior grew more reckless. He bragged openly. He picked fights where silence would have been safer. He acted as if fear alone could hold his world together. But fear without loyalty is fragile. By 1985, the outfit's patience was gone. Word filtered down through the chain. Tony was marked. Not immediately, not publicly, but the decision had been made. The bosses couldn't risk him anymore. They couldn't let his chaos bleed back into Chicago. The ant, once their chosen man, was now expendable. But before the hammer fell, Tony kept moving, still playing his part. He was involved in violent scraps in Vegas. He was tied to murders in Chicago. The FBI, armed with Collada's testimony, pushed cases forward, indictments stacking up. Tony prepared defenses, hired lawyers, smiled for cameras. On the outside, he still looked like the cocky enforcer. On the inside, cracks were spreading. Even his brother Michael, who tried to live more on the legitimate side of things, was pulled into his orbit. A reminder that Tony's life was a storm that swallowed everyone close. And the desert kept its silence. More graves, more whispers, more fear. But by now, fear of Tony was rivaled by fear of what would happen to anyone still standing beside him. His circle shrank. Associates drifted. Even loyalists kept their distance. In the end, Tony Spilotro was a man at war with three armies at once: the law, his enemies, and his own bosses. And wars fought on three fronts rarely end in victory. By the middle of the 1980s, Las Vegas was slipping through his fingers. The casinos no longer bent to his presence. The FBI no longer feared him. They were hunting him. The outfit no longer protected him. They were plotting his end. And Tony, for all his toughness, for all his rage and pride, seemed blind to it. He still played the part of the ant, still dressed sharp, still cracked jokes with waitresses, still carried himself like the king of the desert. But everyone else knew the truth. His time was running out. The mid-1980s were years when the city around him began to shift faster than Anthony Spilotro himself could adapt. He had spent the better part of a decade building his legend in Las Vegas. He was still feared. He still had that fire in his eyes, the quick temper, the fists that had written his story on too many faces. But the city was not the same. The mob's grip on the casinos was loosening. Corporate money was beginning to pour in. Federal pressure was relentless, raids and subpoenas pulling at the outfit's money lines like rats chewing rope. The river of cash wasn't drying up, but it wasn't flowing smooth either. And Spilotro was not the kind of man built for quiet transitions. He thrived on noise, on burglaries, on intimidation, on blood. Where the bosses wanted silence, he brought thunder. Where they needed discretion, he left footprints. To Tony, that was strength. To Chicago, it was suicide. Even so, he carried himself like a man untouchable. He was shorter than most of the men who walked beside him, but he seemed to rise above them anyway. There was something in his presence, in the way his dark eyes locked onto you, in the way his words were delivered without hesitation. He looked like a man who believed in his own myth, but belief doesn't stop bullets. And by '95, everyone around him could sense that the years of swagger had turned into months of desperation. The fallout from the Bertha's burglary still hung heavy. The FBI had been given everything they needed by Frank Collada. Details of jobs, names of victims, instructions given directly from Tony. For a man who had built his reputation on loyalty, Collada's betrayal was a wound that never closed. Tony tried to shrug it off, tried to sneer about rats, but he knew the damage was permanent. The outfit bosses, men who weighed value in profit and silence, had to look at the FBI's files and ask themselves if Spilotro was worth the noise anymore. He kept moving, of course, kept hustling, kept running side deals, kept looking for that next big hit. The hole in the wall gang was broken, but some of his younger recruits still lingered around him, still hungry for whatever scraps of reputation came from standing next to the ant. He directed smaller burglaries, smaller shakedowns, acts of violence that kept his name on the lips of everyone in Vegas. But they were crumbs compared to what he had once controlled. In the casinos, the shift was visible. Nevada's regulators, pushed by federal heat, had blacklisted him. He wasn't supposed to set foot inside the gaming halls anymore, and yet he still hovered near them, showing his face at lounges, waiting outside while his men went in. He couldn't stand the thought of being invisible. He needed people to know he was still there. But every time he showed up, it was more evidence for the FBI, more proof for the outfit that he had become too blatant. And then there was Frank Rosenthal. Their partnership had already fractured beyond repair. Frank was tired of Tony's mess, tired of the affair with Gary, tired of the constant headlines. Where Frank wanted the skim to run like a quiet machine, Tony wanted to feed his ego. They weren't partners anymore. They were two men bound together by the past, each one despising the other. Frank didn't confront Tony directly. That wasn't his way. But the tension leaked into every conversation, every glance. Everyone in their circle knew the truth. The brains and the muscle had split. And when brains and muscle stop working together in the mob, death usually follows. Tony's personal life was no better. His marriage to Nancy was effectively hollow. She'd grown used to living with the shadow of danger, but she never stopped fearing it. Their children felt the absence too. Tony's life was built on the street, not at home. His affair with Gary sputtered on and off, toxic and doomed, filled with arguments and reconciliations that solved nothing. Jerry herself was unraveling, lost in alcohol, pills, and the hollow luxury of being a mobster's wife. She leaned on Tony when Frank turned cold, but Tony couldn't save her, not from herself, and not from the storm around them. The FBI files grew thicker. Witnesses gave statements. Cases were built. The outfit read the newspapers, read the transcripts, heard the whispers. A question hung in the air. Was Tony the ant still an asset, or had he turned into a liability too dangerous to keep? By 1986, that question had an answer. Chicago made its decision. The bosses, practical men who cared only for money and control, decided Spilotro had to go. He had brought too much heat, too much chaos. The skim was shaky enough without the FBI practically living on Tony's doorstep. He wasn't protecting the river anymore. He was damming it with his arrogance. The order wasn't shouted or written down. It never was. It moved quietly, whispered from one man to another until it reached the ears of those who would carry it out. But Tony, blind to the depth of his peril, kept walking his same road. He thought loyalty still meant something, thought his years of service, his brutality, his reputation still protected him. He told friends he was worried, yes, worried about informants, worried about the FBI, but not about the outfit. Never about them. He couldn't believe they'd turn on him. That blindness was fatal. The trap began to take shape. A meeting was arranged back in the Midwest. Tony was told he was being considered for a promotion, a seat at the table of bosses in Chicago. For a man who had always been treated as muscle, who had clawed his way up from street brawls to running Las Vegas, the idea of recognition, of being brought closer into the inner circle, was irresistible. He wanted respect. He wanted to be more than just the enforcer. The bait was perfect. He agreed to go. His younger brother Michael, who had been dragged into his orbit, went with him. Michael wasn't cut from the same cloth. He was softer, less violent, more interested in legitimate business. But he followed Tony anyway. Brothers stick, even when it's dangerous. In June of 1986, they traveled back toward Illinois. To Tony, it was business as usual. To the outfit, it was the beginning of the end. By then, the FBI practically smelled blood. They knew Tony was in trouble. They tracked his movements, watched his house, followed his associates. They knew the outfit had lost patience. But they couldn't predict when or how the hammer would fall. Tony himself carried on as though he were still in control. He talked about the future, about jobs, about power. He didn't talk about death. Men like him rarely did. They believed too much in their own legend. But legends don't stop orders. And the order on Spilotro was already signed in silence. The meeting was set. A house in the Midwest. A gathering of men. Tony thought he was walking into opportunity. He thought he was finally being recognized for his years of work. He thought, maybe, that all the blood, all the beatings, all the loyalty was about to pay off with something more than being the ant. His brother Michael walked beside him. Together, they stepped into a house filled with familiar faces. Men they had known for years, men they had trusted, men they believed were still allies. But the mob doesn't forgive liabilities. And in that moment, the ant finally met the truth he had spent his life avoiding. The doors closed. The circle tightened. And for the first time, Anthony Spilotro wasn't the predator. He was the prey. The summer air in Illinois carried a heavy kind of stillness in June of 1986, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel thicker than it should. Anthony Spilotro stepped into it without hesitation. He had been summoned back from Las Vegas for what he believed was business, the kind of meeting that might finally shift him closer to the boss's table. To him, it was opportunity. To the outfit, it was closure. For years, Tony had been both their sword and their problem. He made them money, protected their skim, scared the hell out of anyone who crossed them. But he had also dragged the spotlight onto Vegas, the one place they needed darkness most. The hole-in-the-wall gang fiasco, the FBI's endless files, the affair with Rosenthal's wife. It had all piled up until there was no balance left. In the mob's cold arithmetic, Spilotro was no longer an asset. He was an exposed wire, sparking too close to gasoline. The bosses gave the quiet nod, and that was all it took. The machinery moved without hesitation. Plans were set. Old friends turned executioners. Tony didn't walk into Illinois alone. His brother Michael went with him. Michael wasn't cut for the life the way Tony was. He was softer, more of a family man, more interested in trying to stay legitimate. But he had always orbited his older brother, always found himself caught in Tony's gravity. This time, the pull would be fatal. They arrived at the house where the meeting was to be held, a quiet suburban place that looked ordinary from the outside. That was the genius of it. No dark alleys, no shadowed corners. Just a house like 1,000 others, blinds drawn against the sun, hiding a circle of men waiting inside. Tony thought he was there to be promoted, to be recognized, maybe even to be patched closer to the outfit's ruling table. That belief carried him through the door. He didn't see the trap until it was too late. Inside, the faces were familiar. Men he'd known for decades, men he'd broken bread with, done jobs with, laughed with. They greeted him the way old friends greet one another. Smiles, nods, handshakes. There was no gun drawn, no shouting. The mob never worked like that when it didn't have to. They lulled you, made you feel safe, let you step willingly into the circle. But the moment the doors shut, the air shifted. The smiles faded, the handshakes ended, the circle tightened. It must have clicked in Tony's mind then. He had lived long enough in that world to recognize the scent of death when it filled a room. Maybe he tried to bluff it off, crack a line, act like he still believed this was business. Maybe he even thought he could fight his way out. After all, he'd fought his way out of everything else. But this was different. This wasn't one man or two. This was the outfit itself, standing in judgment. They went for Michael first. That was the method. Take down the weaker one to send the message. Michael was beaten, fists and feet slamming into him until the air left his lungs, until he crumpled against the carpet. He wasn't built for this. He was never meant to be in that room. His only crime was loyalty to his brother. Tony saw it, and for once, the ant was powerless. He had spent his life making men scream, breaking their bones, stuffing them into shallow graves. Now, he watched the same playbook turned against his own blood. Then, they turned on him. The circle closed tight, a blur of fists, knees, boots. He tried to fight. It was in his nature. He swung back, cursed, clawed for breath. But numbers are numbers. No man, no matter how feared, can outfight a dozen. They pummeled him until his nose broke, until his ribs cracked, until the sharpness in his eyes dulled under swelling. Each blow wasn't just punishment, it was a reckoning, a ledger closing on years of arrogance. They didn't use bullets. That was the mob's way with problems that made headlines. Bullets were loud, messy, traceable. Beatings were cleaner, more final. A man disappears and the world whispers without proof. Michael collapsed first, unconscious or worse. Then, Tony went down, his short frame folding under the weight of the men who had once called him brother. They kept going, because in that life, hesitation meant risk. They kept beating until there was no fight left, no breath left, no sound left. The ant who had once made the desert tremble was reduced to silence on a carpeted floor. When it was done, the room went quiet. The men stood over two broken bodies, breathing heavy, shirts damp with sweat. There was no celebration, no victory, just necessity. The outfit wasn't in the business of gloating. They were in the business of removing problems, and Anthony and Michael Spilotro were problems no longer. The bodies were loaded into a car. No ceremony, no care. Just 2 packages to be delivered. They drove out into Indiana to a cornfield. Flat land, green stalks swaying in the summer air. Far from casinos, far from neon. Far from the city where Tony had built his legend. Out here, the only witnesses were the sky and the soil. Shovels cut into dirt. Holes were dug. The bodies were dumped in side by side, brothers in death as they had been in life. The earth closed over them, erasing the evidence. To the outfit, the job was done. The ant had been crushed, buried in silence, his chapter closed. But silence doesn't last forever. A few days later, the disappearance was noticed. Nancy wondered where Tony was. Friends in Vegas asked questions. The FBI, who had been trailing him for months, realized he had vanished. Rumors churned. Some said he had gone underground. Some said he was hiding from indictments. Others whispered the truth, that the outfit had finally called in the debt. It didn't take long before searchers found the graves. The cornfield gave up its secrets. The Spilotro brothers were unearthed, their bodies battered, their deaths confirmed. The ant hadn't gone into hiding. He hadn't outsmarted the FBI. He hadn't risen to a boss's chair. He had been beaten to death by his own world, betrayed by the loyalty he had always demanded from others. News spread fast. Las Vegas, Chicago, New York, all the places where his name had carried fear, now carried the same headline. Tony the Ant was gone. The man Joe Pesci would later immortalize in film had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when ambition outgrows its leash. For those who had feared him, there was relief. For those who had worked with him, there was silence. No one celebrated too loudly. In that life, today's corpse could be tomorrow's company. For his family, it was devastation. Nancy had lost a husband, his children a father. Michael's family had lost a brother, a man who had followed Tony too far into shadows. For the outfit, it was business as usual. Problems removed, money protected. The river of cash flowed again, quieter without the splash of Tony's chaos. And for history, it was a story written in contradiction. Anthony Spilotro was both feared and foolish, loyal and reckless, brutal and blind. He rose higher than a street brawler should have, but he fell harder than he ever imagined. His end wasn't a blaze of gunfire on the strip. It wasn't a cinematic showdown. It was fists in a quiet house, shovels in a cornfield, and dirt covering two brothers who thought loyalty meant more than it did. The desert he once ruled kept spinning. The casinos lit up every night. Tourists kept throwing dice, never knowing that the shadow they walked past in movies and books had ended in Midwestern soil. The ant was gone. But his legend, twisted and violent, remained. Because that's the way of men like him. They burn hot, leave scars on everyone they touch, and then vanish into dirt. But the stories, they keep walking, long after the man himself is buried. And in the end, that's all Spilotro was. A story. One written in fists, in greed, in betrayal, and finally, in silence. The discovery of Anthony and Michael Spilotro's bodies in that Indiana cornfield sent a shudder through two cities at once. In Chicago, men who had once spoken his name with respect now spoke it with caution. In Las Vegas, the casinos kept buzzing, tourists kept playing, but the shadow of his end settled across the desert. For law enforcement, it was confirmation of what they had long suspected, but rarely witnessed so clearly. The outfit didn't hesitate to bury its own when the balance sheet demanded it. The brothers' disappearance had already raised alarms. Tony had been under constant surveillance. The FBI knew his routines, his hangouts, his associates. When he suddenly went silent, agents didn't think vacation, they thought execution. And when the cornfield gave up its bodies, they had their proof. The photographs of the exhumation, two men, bruised and broken, pulled from shallow earth, circulated through offices like trophies. For agents who had spent years chasing the ant, there was grim satisfaction. He had always seemed untouchable, always managed to slip away. But now he was gone, taken down not by law, but by his own people. Yet, satisfaction was mixed with frustration. The FBI wanted prosecutions, trials, convictions. They wanted names on indictments, not just bodies and dirt. But the outfit had done its work clean. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no paper trails. The men who had swung fists in that quiet house weren't talking, and those who might have known looked the other way. The message was clear. The mob handled its business, and the law could only watch the aftermath. In Las Vegas, the reaction was different. On the casino floors, dealers still shuffled cards, dice still tumbled, lights still glowed against the desert night. Tourists barely noticed. To them, Spilotro was just another name in a paper they didn't read. But for the locals, For those who lived in the city's underbelly, the news hit like a thunderclap. The Ant had ruled their shadows for more than a decade. His name had been enough to silence arguments, to settle debts, to send gamblers running for cover. Now he was gone, and with him went the fear that had hung over the city like a permanent cloud. Some celebrated quietly. Store owners who had lived under the threat of his burglaries, hustlers who had paid his vig, small-time crooks who had dodged his temper. They all felt a weight lift. Others mourned. Not openly, not with flowers or prayers, but in whispers. For all his violence, Spilotro had also been a provider. He had given jobs to men who couldn't work anywhere else, protection to those who needed it, money to friends in tight spots. In the underworld, he wasn't just a predator, he was also a patron. His death left a hole in that ecosystem. Back in Chicago, the outfit carried on as though nothing had happened. That was their way. One day a man was part of the family. The next day he was fertilizer. The silence was chilling. No boasts, no explanations. Just business as usual. But within the silence was a lesson every soldier understood. Loyalty had limits, and no one was bigger than the organization. Michael's death complicated the story. He wasn't a gangster in the same way Tony was. He had dabbled in business, tried to live straighter, but Tony's shadow had pulled him too deep. His murder sent a ripple of unease even among mob loyalists. Killing a made man who had crossed the line was one thing. Killing his brother, who wasn't fully in the life, was another. It sent a message harsher than any bullet. Blood ties meant nothing if the outfit decided you were a risk. The FBI pressed harder. They used Tony's death as leverage, as proof to judges and juries that the mob was ruthless, organized, and real. Indictments flew. Trials followed. The Cornfield murders became a symbol, used in courtrooms to show jurors what the outfit did to its own. Even without direct convictions tied to the killings, the image of two brothers buried side by side in Indiana stuck in the public imagination. In Vegas, Frank Rosenthal lived with a strange mix of vindication and emptiness. His rivalry with Tony had poisoned their partnership long before the end. The affair with Gary, the arrogance, the headlines, all of it had driven a wedge between them. Frank knew the outfit had to make a choice, and Tony had paid the price. But even Frank couldn't escape the truth. Without Tony, his own position was more fragile. He had lost his muscle, his protector, the man who kept fear alive on the casino floors. For a man who thrived on odds, Rosenthal must have known his own were shortening. And then there was Gary. Her world crumbled completely. The affair that had tied her to Tony ended in blood, leaving her adrift, addicted, unraveling. She spiraled into darker places, her beauty fading, her life collapsing. Tony's death didn't just kill him, it haunted everyone who had been close to him. For Nancy, the grief was quieter but no less sharp. She had lived with fear for years, raising children under the shadow of a man who belonged more to the streets than to his home. She had braced for this outcome, maybe even expected it, but expectation doesn't dull the reality of a husband buried in another state, beaten into silence by the same men he once served. The mob world absorbed the loss the way it always did, by filling the vacuum. Other enforcers rose, other crews picked up the slack. Vegas moved deeper into corporate hands, less ruled by fear, more by shareholders in boardrooms. The city began to shed some of its mob skin, though the scars remained under the surface. But Tony's legend didn't die with him. In the years that followed, stories grew. Some painted him as a monster, a sadistic thug who brought ruin on himself. Others remembered him as a street kid who climbed higher than anyone thought possible, a man whose fists and rage made him larger than life. The truth lay somewhere between, twisted by memory and myth. The FBI used his name in training sessions, a case study in how the mob handled its business and how federal persistence could push cracks into their walls. Prosecutors dropped his story into trials, reminding jurors that the men before them were part of an organization willing to bury its own alive. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers picked it up too. His brutal death, paired with his violent life, made for irresistible drama. When Joe Pesci brought him to life on screen years later, audiences gasped at the ferocity, the paranoia, the sudden explosion of violence. Few realized how close the fiction was to fact. The cornfield wasn't just a scene in a movie. It was real soil, real shovels, real blood. And through it all, Las Vegas kept glowing. Tourists still lined up for shows, still dropped coins into slots, still chased dreams under neon skies. The city doesn't mourn its shadows, it buries them, builds new towers over the graves, and keeps the lights burning. But beneath those lights, in the whispers of old-timers, in the quiet corners of casinos, Tony's name lingered. The ant, the enforcer, the man who had once walked through the stardust like he owned it. His death didn't erase his presence. If anything, it carved it deeper. He became part of the city's mythology, a reminder that behind the glamour was always grit, that behind the dice was always blood. For the outfit, his end was just another page turned. For the FBI, it was a victory wrapped in frustration. For his family, it was a wound that never fully closed. For history, it was the inevitable outcome of a man who could never temper his fire. The cornfield closed over his body, but his story refused to stay buried. After the Spilotro brothers were pulled from the Indiana dirt, the world didn't stop turning. Planes still landed in Las Vegas, gamblers still packed into casinos, and the outfit's skimming machine still coughed up cash, though more cautiously now. But Tony's death had shifted something permanent. The fear that once hung thick over the Strip no longer carried his name, and the legend of Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro began to split into two lives, the man who lived and the myth he left behind. For law enforcement, his death was both a frustration and an opportunity. They hadn't put him in the ground. The outfit had done that for them, but they could use it. Prosecutors painted the cornfield killing as proof of the outfit's brutality, a flesh and blood reminder that organized crime wasn't just a collection of rumors and whispers, it was real. It had rules, it had punishments, and the punishment for becoming too noisy, too reckless, was burial in shallow soil. FBI briefings turned his story into a case study. New agents were shown photos of the cornfield, taught how even the most feared mobsters could become expendable. His file became required reading in offices across the country. To the Bureau, he wasn't just another gangster, he was a warning. Arrogance and visibility destroy men faster than bullets. In Chicago, the outfit said nothing. Silence was their language. No public funerals, no statements, no explanations. The bosses carried on, money flowing back into their pockets. If anyone whispered about Spilotro, it was only as an example. He had been useful, then reckless, then gone. They closed his chapter as coldly as they had opened it. That was the mob's way. But silence in Chicago couldn't stop the noise elsewhere. Las Vegas changed. For years, Tony's presence had been visible in the lounges and back rooms, his reputation a constant undertone. With him gone, the landscape began shifting more rapidly. Corporations were buying into the city, men in suits with shareholders, to please replacing men with pistols tucked in their belts. Casinos were turning from mob playgrounds into legitimate businesses, or at least the appearance of legitimacy. The days of outfit skimming weren't over, but they were numbered, and the removal of Spilotro sped up that transformation. Yet, in the smaller corners of Vegas, his absence was felt differently. To the hustlers, the bookmakers, the desperate gamblers who had lived under his shadow, the vacuum left confusion. Some felt relief. No more fists, no more sudden visits from the Ants men. Others felt exposed. Without him, who was left to enforce deals, to maintain order in the underworld. A city without a monster sometimes births smaller, meaner ones, and Vegas wasn't immune. Tony's family bore the heaviest weight. Nancy Spilotro, who had lived for years in the uneasy quiet of being a mob wife, faced the reality of widowhood and the sharp edge of stigma. Her children carried the name of a man who had been feared in 2 states. For Michael's family, the bitterness was doubled. He had never been the gangster his brother was, but he had paid the same price. To them, Tony hadn't just died. He had dragged Michael into the grave with him. But as time passed, another layer began to form, the layer of story. Writers smelled blood in his tale. Journalists penned features about the violent enforcer who had ruled the desert and died in farmland soil. Magazines carried photos of the brothers, of the grave, of the casinos where Tony had strutted. True crime authors wove him into their books, detailing the burglaries, the beatings, the affair with Gary Rosenthal, the betrayal of Frank Collada. His life was too cinematic to stay on the page alone. And then came Hollywood. Martin Scorsese's Casino, released in 1995, etched Spilotro's legacy into pop culture forever. Joe Pesci's portrayal, brutal, paranoid, short-tempered, violent, wasn't just inspired by Tony. It was Tony, refracted through cinema's lens. The vice scene, the cornfield beating, the explosive temper, it all came from Spilotro's reality. Audiences around the world who had never heard his name before now knew him as a symbol of mob violence in Las Vegas. For his family, the movie was salt in the wound. Nancy resented the way her husband was turned into entertainment, his flaws exaggerated for the sake of drama, his death replayed on screen for millions. But there was no stopping it. Once Hollywood touched a story, it lived forever. And for better or worse, the world would remember Tony Spilotro not just as a man, but as Joe Pesci's snarling shadow on the big screen. The irony was cruel. Tony had spent his life chasing respect, chasing the seat at the table that always seemed just out of reach. In death, he got recognition, more than he ever imagined. But it was recognition as a cautionary tale, as a monster, as the mobster who flew too close to the sun and burned. In Las Vegas, his ghost lingered. Old dealers remembered the way he stood at their tables, eyes drilling into them as they shuffled cards. Former hustlers told stories of the beatings, the threats, the way he made grown men shake. Taxi drivers, bartenders, showgirls, all had a Tony story. Some were true, some embellished, but they kept his presence alive. For years after, if you asked about the old days on the Strip, his name came up. Law enforcement used his end as momentum. Cases were pushed harder, skimming operations broken, mob influence cracked. The cornfield became a symbol, a story juries couldn't ignore. Prosecutors didn't have to explain the danger of the outfit anymore. They could point to Spilotro, to his grave, and let the silence speak. But even as the law celebrated, a darker admiration persisted in some corners. To young hustlers, Tony's story carried a kind of grim romance. He had been a street kid from Chicago who clawed his way into Vegas, who walked among bosses, who struck fear into a city. His death was brutal, yes, but it was also proof that he had mattered. In their eyes, he wasn't just a thug. He was a man who had lived large, who had left a mark. That's the contradiction of his legacy. He was both feared and admired, both despised and remembered. To victims of his violence, he was a nightmare. To friends, he was loyalty itself, until paranoia cracked him. To the outfit, he was useful, then disposable. To history, he was unforgettable. And so, as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, as Las Vegas glittered with new hotels and corporate names, the ghost of Tony Spilotro walked quietly beneath the neon. Not in the casinos, not in the alleyways, but in the stories told at bars, in FBI briefings, in courtrooms, in movie theaters. His body had been buried in Indiana, but his legend was rooted deep in the desert. The cornfield was just an end. The myth was just beginning. The 1990s opened with Las Vegas wearing a new face. Towering hotels rose on the Strip. The Mirage, Treasure Island, later the Bellagio, casinos that shimmered with corporate polish instead of mob shadows. The days of envelopes being slipped into back rooms weren't entirely over, but the skimming era was fading into history. For men like Anthony Spilotro, the city had no place anymore. He was gone, buried in Indiana soil, yet his ghost seemed to linger in every whispered story about the old Vegas. But the real weight of his absence wasn't on the Strip. It was on the people he left behind. His wife Nancy, his children, and his brother Michael's family all carried his name like a brand. In neighborhoods around Chicago and in pockets of Las Vegas, the Spilotro name was both infamous and heavy. School teachers, neighbors, shopkeepers, everyone knew it. For the kids, growing up meant facing questions they never asked to answer. Is your father the gangster? Didn't he die in that cornfield? Children carry their parents' sins even when they don't deserve them. Nancy herself wrestled with anger and grief. She had lived in the shadow of Tony's life for years, knowing what he was but never able to change him. She had raised children with the constant hum of fear in the background, fear of the FBI, fear of rivals, fear of Tony himself. When the news of his death came, it wasn't shock, it was inevitability. But inevitability doesn't make the grave any less cold. She withdrew from the spotlight, choosing silence over explanation. For her, there was nothing to explain. Tony had lived by the rules of his world, and he had died by them. Michael's death still cut deeper. He had never been the same kind of gangster Tony was, never carried the same reputation. Yet he had followed his brother, and loyalty had dragged him down too. His family struggled with bitterness. To them, Tony had been reckless, and Michael had paid for it. Their grief carried anger, sharper than mourning alone. Meanwhile, Frank Collada, the childhood friend turned informant, was rebuilding his life under the government's witness protection program. His testimony had sealed many cases and helped paint the full picture of Tony's empire. But Collada's betrayal haunted him too. To mob loyalists, he was the rat who had turned on the ant. To law enforcement, he was a necessary evil, proof that even the most loyal soldier could flip when the pressure grew heavy enough. Collada spent the rest of his life telling stories, giving interviews, eventually even guiding tours in Las Vegas about his days with Tony. His survival became another layer of the legend. The rat outlived the ant. For the FBI and prosecutors, the Spilotro case remained a tool. They used his story in trials against higher-ranking outfit members, weaving the cornfield murders into narratives about mob brutality. Even when juries didn't convict on specific charges, the image of two brothers beaten and buried resonated. It made organized crime real, stripped away any romantic illusions jurors might have carried. And then came the movies. Martin Scorsese's Casino hit theaters in 1995, and suddenly the world knew Tony Spilotro, though not by name. Joe Pesci's character, Nicky Santoro, was a thin disguise, lifted straight from Spilotro's life. The violence, the paranoia, the short temper, the affair with his partner's wife. It was all there. Even the cornfield beating, depicted in excruciating detail, mirrored the real end. Audiences gasped, horrified, and mesmerized. For many, it was the first time they'd heard of Spilotro. For others, it confirmed everything they had already read in newspapers and true crime books. But for his family, the movie was agony. Nancy hated it, resented the way Hollywood turned her husband's life into entertainment. The children had to sit in classrooms where classmates quoted Pesci's lines, not realizing they were mocking a real man's death. Still, the movie immortalized him. Spilotro became larger than life, cemented as part of American mob mythology alongside Al Capone, John Gotti, and Lucky Luciano. The irony was sharp. He had spent his life chasing recognition, chasing a seat at the table, and in death, Hollywood gave him the fame he never earned in the outfit. But it was fame twisted into infamy. In Las Vegas, the legend was both embraced and buried. Corporate casino owners liked to distance themselves from the mob past, but tour guides, writers, and storytellers kept the memory alive. Visitors wanted to hear about the old days, when men like Spilotro ruled the shadows. They wanted to hear about burglaries, about the vice, about the cornfield. Tony's name became currency in the tourism trade, sold in books, whispered on bus tours, stamped into the mythology of a city that thrives on stories. Yet the truth was darker than any legend. Behind the neon and the Hollywood gloss was a man who had been brutal, often paranoid, capable of kindness, but more often cruelty. Friends remembered his loyalty, but victims remembered his fists. Families remembered him as a father and brother, but lawmen remembered him as a predator. The contradiction became part of his shadow. Was he monster, man, or both? Meanwhile, the outfit itself stumbled through the 1990s. Federal investigations hammered at their structures, and without men like Spilotro keeping Vegas in line, their hold on the city weakened. The skim faded as corporations locked down the books. Trials exposed the hierarchy. The mob still existed, but it was a ghost of the power it once held. The ant had been both a weapon and a symptom. His death marked the beginning of the end of the outfit's golden years in Las Vegas. Documentaries and books filled the void. Reporters dug into the details of his life, his childhood in Chicago, his rise through the ranks, his friendship with Collada, his ruthless enforcement, his reckless ambition. Each retelling added another coat of paint to the picture. Some emphasized the violence, others the ambition, still others the inevitability of his downfall. None could resist the cornfield ending. In Chicago, his grave became a quiet place, visited more by curiosity seekers than mourners. Few mobsters are remembered with flowers. Their legacy lives not in cemeteries but in stories. And Tony's story, retold again and again, grew into a cautionary tale. To the law, he was the gangster who proved the mob would eat its own. To street kids chasing gangster dreams, he was proof of how far you could climb and how fast you could fall. Through the 2000s, his legend only deepened. Television shows like Mobsters and American Greed profiled his rise and fall. Podcasts dissected his every move. His name resurfaced every time the mob was mentioned in connection to Las Vegas. In some ways, he became bigger in death than he had ever been in life. For his family, it never ended. His children grew older under the weight of the name. Some spoke out, trying to tell their side. Others stayed silent, tired of carrying his ghost. Nancy faded from public view, living her later years far from the noise. She had lost not just a husband, but the chance at a normal life decades earlier. His choices had been her burden. Frank Collada, in his later years, leaned into his own notoriety. He gave interviews, wrote books, told tourists about Tony as if he were guiding them through a museum of violence. Some despised him for it, calling him a rat cashing in on betrayal. Others saw it as history told firsthand. Either way, Collada kept the ant alive in stories, long after the cornfield closed. In Las Vegas itself, the city grew brighter, bigger, louder, more corporate with every passing year. Yet beneath the lights, the shadow of men like Spilotro never fully vanished. Locals remembered. The older generation told stories to the young. There was a time when this wasn't all family shows and roller coasters. There was a time when the ant walked these streets and people crossed to the other side when they saw him coming. That was his legacy. Not statues, not honors, not family pride. Fear, stories, and caution. He became a figure parents warned their sons about, a reminder that the path of quick money and iron fists ends in shallow dirt. Yet, paradoxically, he also became a figure admired by some, the way gangsters always do. The myth of power, the myth of control, the myth of living large until the end. Those myths cling harder than facts. Tony's legend fed into that, even as his reality told a darker truth. By the time the century turned, Anthony Spilotro was no longer just a man who had lived and died. He was a piece of American folklore, as much myth as history. He was Chicago's street kid turned Las Vegas's enforcer, a man who believed fear could shield him forever. He was proof that even the loudest men in the mob end the same way, betrayed, beaten, buried. And still, people told his story. Still, his name lingered in Vegas bars, in FBI briefings, in movies, in books. The ant was dead, but his ghost walked on. By the early 2000s, Las Vegas was no longer the desert town Anthony Spilotro had once walked through like a predator guarding his prey. It had become a gleaming monument to corporate ambition, with hotels bigger than neighborhoods and casinos that looked more like theme parks than dens of vice. Families brought children to see pirate ships sink in artificial lagoons or volcanoes erupt in neon fire. The mob wasn't gone completely, but the stage no longer belonged to them. Yet, in the quiet spaces beneath the neon and the backroom stories told to anyone willing to listen, The name Spilotro still lingered like cigarette smoke that refuses to leave the drapes. His death in 1986 was almost 2 decades past, but the story hadn't faded. If anything, it grew sharper with time. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists found in him the perfect character: short, fiery, violent, ambitious, undone by his own hunger for power. His brother's death gave the tragedy weight. His cornfield burial gave it the grim ending that no novelist could have written better. And so the ant became more alive in memory than he had ever been in flesh. Tourism in Las Vegas caught on quickly. Mob museums sprouted, guided tours took visitors to old haunts, and storytellers spun yarns about the days when the outfit ran the town from smoky backrooms. Spilotro's name was always there, front and center. Guides described him as the enforcer who made cheaters' fingers snap like twigs, as the burglar king of the hole-in-the-wall gang, as the man who thought he owned the desert until the Midwest swallowed him whole. The FBI, for its part, leaned into the myth for educational purposes. Training seminars used his case to show recruits the dangers of mob life, the brutality of internal justice, and the thin line between power and paranoia. Agents who had worked the Vegas files in the 1970s and 1980s gave talks about how close they'd come to catching him, how his arrogance had made their jobs easier, and how in the end, the outfit had done their work for them. His name became shorthand inside law enforcement circles. "Don't go full Spilotro" meant don't draw so much attention that your own side takes you out. Meanwhile, Hollywood's shadow stretched even further. After Casino in 1995, Tony's story reached millions who had never read a newspaper article about him. Joe Pesci's Nicky Santoro burned into popular imagination, the short man with the explosive temper, the sadistic streak, the violent end. For many, the movie was the story, fact blurred with fiction until reality barely mattered. Viewers quoted his lines, mimicked his gestures, spoke of Nicky as though he were real. And through him, Spilotro lived again. For the Spilotro family, the spotlight was unwelcome. Nancy had long retreated into privacy, carrying her grief like a private stone. The children struggled in different ways, some angry, some silent, all forced to carry a name that drew stares and whispers. They weren't the stars of Casino. They weren't the criminals in the newspapers, but they paid the price of association. For every retelling, for every documentary, they relived what they had already lost. Michael's family bore the heaviest bitterness. His death had been collateral, loyalty punished with a shallow grave. He had not been the enforcer, not the man carving holes into jewelry store walls, not the predator feared in casinos. He had followed his brother, and for that, he had died. His children, too, carried that mark, reminders of a man who might have lived a quiet life, if not for blood ties. In Chicago, the outfit limped into the new millennium a shadow of itself. Federal prosecutions had torn chunks out of its structure, and the era of endless Vegas money had closed. But Tony's story still echoed in neighborhood bars and in the whispered warnings of older men. "Remember what happened to the ant," they'd say, reminding young hustlers that ambition without restraint only led one place. Frank Collada, meanwhile, reinvented himself as both historian and entertainer. Protected by his deal with the government, he spent years retelling stories of his time with Tony. He guided tours in Las Vegas, taking curious visitors to the spots where jobs had gone down, where Tony had ruled, where blood had been spilled. Some despised him for it, calling him a rat making money off betrayal. Others leaned in eagerly, fascinated by his insider details. Collada's words kept Tony's ghost alive, even when they came from the mouth of the man who had helped bury him figuratively before the outfit buried him literally. Television in the 2000s found fertile ground in Spilotro's legacy. Shows like Mobsters and American Greed ran episodes about him, replaying the cornfield story, dramatizing the hole-in-the-wall gang, and painting him as both villain and victim of his own ambition. Viewers ate it up. Tony became part of the crime documentary canon, his face and story recycled across cable channels late into the night. But while the public devoured the legend, the reality remained harsher. Tony had been violent, often sadistic. The Vice story wasn't just Hollywood flair, it was rooted in truth. The beatings, the threats, the burglaries, the fear he carried into every room, those weren't myths. They were the scars left on real people. For the victims, his legend was just salt on old wounds. Still, myths have power, and in Las Vegas, myths sell. By the 2010s, the Mob Museum in downtown Las Vegas had opened, its exhibits filled with photographs, artifacts, and stories from the city's criminal past. Spilotro had his place there, alongside Capone, Gotti, and Rosenthal. Tourists lined up to read his name, to see the world he had once ruled. The irony was bitter. In life, the law hunted him. In death, the city turned him into a museum piece, a tourist attraction. Younger generations, who had never known Vegas under mob rule, learned his name through movies, TV, and museum plaques. To them, he was almost folklore, like Wyatt Earp or Billy the Kid, another violent man turned legend. They didn't feel the fear he once inspired. They felt fascination. Meanwhile, in Chicago, old-timers still told his story differently. In neighborhood diners and smoky bars, they remembered the kid from the West Side who grew into the ant. Some remembered him fondly, a loyal friend who would fight for you as fast as he'd fight against you. Others remembered him as reckless, a man whose temper outpaced his sense, who thought he could outshine the bosses and paid the price. Either way, they all agreed on one thing: he had burned too hot, too fast. By now, decades after his burial, Tony's story had been retold so many times that the line between truth and fiction blurred beyond recognition. Was he as sadistic as Pesci's Nicky Santoro? Was he more loyal, more calculating, less reckless? Did he really believe the outfit would protect him until the end? Each retelling tilted the story differently, but the one constant was the ending. Fists, boots, and dirt in a cornfield. And that's what cemented his legacy. The ending was perfect in its brutality. No courtroom, no prison cell, no exile. Just betrayal at the hands of his own, the same hands that had once fed him. It fit the mob's story arc too well to ever be forgotten. It was Shakespearean in its inevitability, a gangster's Macbeth undone by ambition and paranoia. As the 2010s rolled on, true crime podcasts and streaming documentaries revived his story for new audiences. Netflix, YouTube, cable reruns all carried the tale of the ant. Younger viewers who hadn't even been born when he died now debated his choices, his flaws, his end. His story lived on not just in history books but in digital sound bites, ready to be replayed endlessly. For his family, it never ended. The shadow never lifted. Every new documentary, every new interview with Collada, every new dramatization reopened old wounds. For them, Tony wasn't a myth. He was a husband, a father, a brother. He was laughter at a dinner table, anger behind a closed door, fear when headlights slowed outside their home. They knew the legend, but they lived the man. For Las Vegas, his story became part of the city's layered identity. Vegas thrives on reinvention, on swallowing its past and dressing it up as nostalgia. Tony was folded into that process. His violence, his chaos, his downfall, all became part of the story Vegas sells to tourists. Come see the glitter, but don't forget the grit. The ant's ghost is part of the package, another attraction in the city of attractions. And so, 3 decades after his death, Anthony Spilotro remained where he had always wanted to be. Talked about, not respected the way he had dreamed, not seated at the table of bosses, not remembered as a king, but talked about endlessly in bars, in courtrooms, in documentaries, in museums. In the end, that was his immortality. By the late 2010s, Las Vegas had become almost unrecognizable compared to the town Anthony Spilotro once patrolled like a neighborhood bully with a city for his block. The Strip shimmered with billion-dollar resorts, the Cosmopolitan, City Center, Wynn Encore, polished monuments of glass and steel where corporate boards, not mob bosses, called the shots. But even as Las Vegas reinvented itself again and again, the shadow of its mob years never disappeared. It lingered in whispers, in old photographs, in the way locals talked about back when the outfit ran things. And at the center of those whispers, as always, was Tony the Ant. 3 decades had passed since his body and his brothers were shoveled out of Indiana dirt, but the fascination with him had not faded. If anything, it had grown. The internet had become the new machine for storytelling, and Spilotro's story found endless fuel. Documentaries streamed on Netflix, YouTube channels dissected his every move, podcasts replayed the cornfield murder in slow detail, blogs debated his psychology. Audiences from across the world, many of whom hadn't been born when he died, consumed his life as entertainment. Las Vegas itself leaned into its darker past. The Mob Museum in downtown, which opened in 2012, became one of the city's most popular attractions. Tourists walked through exhibits on organized crime, prohibition, wiretaps, and Vegas's bloody underbelly. And of course, Spilotro's face and name were there. His life presented as history, his death framed as part of the city's transformation. The irony was sharp. In life, he had been hunted by lawmen, reviled by casinos, feared by citizens. In death, he was a selling point, part of the brand of a city that never wasted anything, not even its ghosts. The Mob Museum didn't glorify him, but it didn't ignore him either. Visitors read about the hole-in-the-wall gang, about his reputation for violence, about the cornfield. Some left fascinated, others disturbed. But all left knowing his name. The Ant had achieved what he always wanted. People remembered him. Meanwhile, pop culture kept him alive. Casino had already cemented his legend in the 1990s, but younger audiences rediscovered the film in streaming libraries. Joe Pesci's Nicky Santoro terrified a new generation, and every time the credits rolled, viewers Googled the real man. They found articles, books, podcasts, all waiting to retell Tony's story, with each version layering myth on top of fact. In Chicago, old-timers still muttered about him in diners and corner bars. Some remembered the street kid who never knew his place, who thought he could outshine the bosses. Others remembered the loyalty he once showed to friends before paranoia twisted him. They all remembered his end. The cornfield murder had become shorthand for mob justice. Don't go the way of the ant, they'd say, meaning, don't draw too much attention, don't forget you're expendable. But outside of mob circles, Spilotro's story had turned into something bigger, a parable. To law enforcement, he was proof of the FBI's patience and persistence, and of the outfit's ruthlessness when a soldier became a liability. To Vegas, he was part of the city's history, a reminder that beneath the neon had always been blood. To true crime fans, he was a perfect character, violent, ambitious, reckless, doomed. For his family, though, the years never softened the wound. Nancy had long ago stepped into silence, but her children still bore the weight of their name. Every documentary, every retelling, every dramatization was another reopening of scars. For them, Tony wasn't Pesci's Santoro, wasn't a museum exhibit. He was the man who sat at their table, who shouted in their home, who lived and died by choices they never asked to share. They carried his story whether they wanted to or not. Michael's family carried bitterness that never faded. His death was collateral damage, loyalty punished. In the decades since, they struggled to explain how a man who wasn't even deep in the life ended up in the dirt beside his brother. Their grief was different. It was anger that Michael had been dragged down by blood ties, punished for standing too close to the ant's flame. And then, there was Frank Collada. Until his death in 2020, he remained one of the loudest voices keeping Spilotro's story alive. Collada embraced the notoriety, giving interviews, writing books, even running mob tours in Las Vegas. He told stories about their burglaries, their nights in Vegas, their betrayals. Some saw him as a rat profiting from treachery. Others saw him as a rare insider, giving history straight from the source. Either way, he ensured Tony's name never left the stage. Even in death, Collada's shadow was tied to Spilotro's. One man buried in a cornfield, the other guiding tourists past casinos where their ghosts still lingered. The fascination wasn't only in America. Around the world, readers and viewers devoured stories of the mob. Spilotro's name traveled far beyond Chicago and Las Vegas, becoming part of global crime folklore. His life was studied in universities, dissected in criminology courses, used as a case study for ambition unchecked by discipline. His death was presented as textbook mob justice. The organization always comes first, and no man is too feared to be buried. By the late 2010s, social media gave his myth new fuel. Clips of casinos circulated on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Young viewers quoted Pesci's lines without realizing they came from Spilotro's real life. Memes made him a character beyond history, a kind of anti-hero in internet culture. The Ant, who had once been a street thug fighting for respect, was now a digital ghost, endlessly replicated in short videos and posts. Las Vegas itself doubled down on selling its past. Alongside shows about magic and music, tourists could book mob tours, sit in restaurants that advertised their old mob connections, or buy t-shirts with caricatures of gangsters. Spilotro's legacy became part of the city's economy. He had been a liability in life, but in death, he was an asset. But beneath the spectacle, the truth remained. Anthony Spilotro had been a violent man, feared for good reason. He had broken lives as easily as he broke locks. He had terrified gamblers, bullied employees, hurt anyone who crossed him. The Vice story wasn't myth, it was brutality. His hole-in-the-wall gang wasn't clever, it was reckless. His affair with Rosenthal's wife wasn't romantic, it was suicidal. The truth was uglier than the legend, but legends always outshine ugliness. In Chicago, whispers of the outfit still existed, but they were a shadow of their former strength. Federal prosecutions had gutted the old structures. The skim was long gone. The world that created Spilotro had ended, but his story lived on as a relic of that world. By the time the 2020s arrived, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro had been dead for nearly 35 years. Yet his story was more alive than ever. New documentaries aired, podcasts debated whether Casino exaggerated his cruelty or merely showed the truth. Crime historians updated his files with context from FBI records. His face, once feared on the streets of Chicago and Vegas, now appeared on TV screens, in books, on museum walls. He had become what he always wanted to be, unforgettable. But his immortality came at a cost. He wasn't remembered as a boss, not as a leader, not as a respected figure in the outfit. He was remembered as violent, reckless, paranoid, betrayed. He was remembered for his ending. And maybe that's the final irony of the Ant's life. He had clawed his way up, demanded loyalty, demanded respect, demanded fear. He had dreamed of sitting at the table. Instead, he ended up under a table, beaten to death, remembered less for power than for failure. Still, the story sells. Still, the name lives. Still, the Ant walks the strip at night in whispers, in stories, in neon shadows. He has become what Las Vegas always makes of its ghosts, a legend. By the 2020s, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro had been in the ground for nearly 4 decades, yet his story refused to die with him. It had become something beyond biography, part history, part myth, part spectacle. He was no longer just a Chicago street kid who clawed his way into Las Vegas, nor simply the violent enforcer beaten into silence in an Indiana house. He was a symbol, a piece of the American crime saga that never loses its audience. The city he once terrorized had transformed again. Las Vegas in the present era was more polished than ever, its strip lined with billion-dollar resorts, its casinos designed like palaces, its entertainment geared toward families, international tourists, and digital spectacle. The mob that once fed off its bloodstream had all but vanished, driven out by law enforcement and replaced by corporate owners who answered to shareholders, not outfit bosses. But the mob's ghost, Tony's ghost, remained, and the city had learned to profit from it. The Mob Museum in downtown Las Vegas became the clearest example. By 2020, it was no longer a novelty attraction, but a staple of the city's cultural life. School groups toured its halls. Historians praised its archives. Tourists snapped selfies in front of exhibits showing Tommy guns, old wiretaps, and mugshots of long-dead gangsters. Spilotro was part of it all. His story was framed not as glamour, but as a grim lesson in the costs of ambition and violence. Still, the cornfield photos, the hole-in-the-wall tales, the vice stories, they drew the same morbid fascination as any crime legend. Visitors left shaking their heads, whispering, "I can't believe this really happened." Television and streaming kept his name alive too. Netflix documentaries about Vegas crime recycled his story, splicing together interviews with FBI agents, old mobsters, and journalists who had covered him. Podcasts replayed the details of his life, his childhood in Chicago, his rise through the outfit, his brutality, his affair with Gary Rosenthal, his paranoia, his beating. Hosts spoke of him in tones halfway between disgust and awe. The Vice story was retold again and again, whether embellished or not, because it captured his reputation in one unforgettable image: ruthless, merciless, terrifying. Joe Pesci's portrayal of Nicky Santoro in Casino still cast the longest shadow. For younger generations, the movie was their introduction to Tony Spilotro. Clips circulated endlessly online. Memes spread. Fans debated whether Scorsese had exaggerated or softened the truth. Some insisted the real Spilotro had been even worse. Others argued the film turned him into a caricature. But either way, the connection was permanent. Spilotro and Santoro were fused in cultural memory. His family, though, lived with the consequences. They had endured decades of carrying his name, of seeing his death replayed as entertainment. Nancy had faded from public view, but her children still bore the burden. For them, Tony was not a myth. He was the man who came home late, who barked orders, who carried violence in his pockets like spare change. His choices shaped their lives long after he was gone. Michael's family remained bitter. Time had not dulled the anger of losing him in the same grave as his brother. To them, Michael's murder had been unnecessary, an act of overkill by the outfit. He had been dragged into the shadows by Tony's orbit, and he had paid with his life. Their grief carried not just sorrow, but accusation. Law enforcement continued to use Tony's story as a teaching tool. At FBI academies, agents learned about the Spilotro case as an example of both investigative persistence and mob ruthlessness. They studied the way his paranoia exposed him, the way his ambition drew attention, the way his bosses finally silenced him when he became a liability. The lesson was clear. Organized crime eats its own when survival demands it. In Chicago, old outfit hands still told stories of him. To some, he was a reckless hothead who didn't understand discipline. To others, he was a loyal soldier who simply burned too bright. But they all agreed on one thing. He had died the only way he could have, beaten by the same code he had lived by. True crime culture in the 2020s gave his name a second life. Podcasts with millions of listeners retold his story, dramatizing his rise and fall like serialized novels. YouTube channels produced hour-long videos dissecting every detail of his career. Comment sections filled with debates. Was he brilliant or foolish? Was he more brutal than other mobsters or just more notorious? Viewers in Europe, Asia, and South America, far from Chicago or Las Vegas, now spoke his name as though they'd grown up in his shadow. Las Vegas itself learned to balance its polished corporate identity with its darker past. On one hand, resorts sold glamour, comfort, and family-friendly entertainment. On the other, the city embraced its mob history as part of its unique brand. Walking tours promised the real Vegas, complete with stories of Spilotro's burglaries and the desert graves that once dotted the outskirts. Bars leaned into the theme, serving cocktails named after old mobsters. Tony's name appeared on plaques, in exhibits, in tour guides' scripts. He was no longer a liability to the city. He was an asset, a piece of nostalgia wrapped in danger. Yet the truth never softened. Every retelling included the cornfield. Every documentary lingered on the brutality of his end. The ant was remembered less for his power than for his fall. his violence, his paranoia, his betrayal of Frank Rosenthal with Gary, all of it became part of the cautionary tale. He was remembered as proof that ambition without control destroys itself. And still, fascination lingered. Part of it was the American obsession with gangsters, with men who rise from nothing to wield power, only to fall in blood. Part of it was the irresistible drama of his story. Street kid, enforcer, Vegas king, betrayed and buried. And part of it was the way he lived. Loud, reckless, impossible to ignore. By the present day, Anthony Spilotro's name had outlasted the outfit itself. The mob that had made him was a shadow, its power broken, its men aging or dead. But Tony's story remained alive, replayed in films, documentaries, museums, podcasts, and whispers. He had become what he always craved, unforgettable, but not in the way he wanted. He was remembered not as a boss, not as a respected leader, not as a man who secured a seat at the table. He was remembered as violent, reckless, betrayed. He was remembered for his death. The ant's immortality was real, but it was twisted. And maybe that was fitting. Because in the end, Tony Spilotro's story was not about triumph. It was about the illusion of triumph. It was about how fear can build an empire, but never protect it. It was about how loyalty in the mob is a coin that spins both ways. It was about how even the most feared man in Las Vegas can end up in a hole in Indiana dirt. Las Vegas moved on, brighter than ever, but the legend stayed. And as long as people crave stories of crime, betrayal, and downfall, the ant will walk its streets forever, smaller than he seemed, but larger than life. By the time 4 decades had passed since Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro was lowered into Indiana dirt, his story had slipped from the immediacy of newsprint and police reports into something else entirely: myth. Not myth in the sense of fairy tale, but myth in the deeper way. Human beings recycle certain lives into cautionary tales, campfire stories, and cultural shorthand. Tony had gone from being a short, stocky kid on the west side of Chicago to a name whispered in Las Vegas casinos, to finally a symbol of how ambition without limits burns itself out. The broader American mythology of crime has always had its characters. Al Capone, larger than life in the 1920s, his fedora tilted and cigar clamped, was remembered as both ruthless killer and Depression-era Robin Hood. Lucky Luciano became the architect of the national syndicate. John Gotti strutted through the 1980s as the Teflon Don, smiling in tailored suits while juries failed to convict him. Into this gallery of figures, Anthony Spilotro carved his place, though not as boss or architect. He belonged to the category of men who embodied violence, muscle that rose too high, too visible, and collapsed under its own shadow. In the American imagination, gangsters often serve as mirrors. They represent the hunger for power, the pursuit of respect, the promise of wealth untethered by law. But they also represent the fall that comes when the dream grows too greedy. Spilotro fit this perfectly. His story had the sharp rise, the boy from Chicago who bullied his way into the outfit, the enforcer who moved to Las Vegas and ruled its shadows. And it had the inevitable crash, betrayal, paranoia, and fists hammering him into silence in a quiet Midwestern house. As the years passed, this arc made him less a man and more a symbol. College criminology classes used his case to explain mob structure, enforcement, and internal justice. Psychology courses dissected his temper, his need for respect, his inability to control paranoia. Writers used his name in essays about ambition, about loyalty, about the ways power corrodes. Podcasters turned his biography into serialized morality plays. He was no longer just Tony the Ant. He was a lesson. The strange part was how his story was told in 2 tones at once. On one hand, he was cast as monster. The vice story, the beatings, the burglaries, all painted him as sadistic, cruel, reckless. He became the archetype of mob violence unchecked by reason. On the other hand, he was cast as tragic anti-hero, a street kid who wanted more, who refused to be small, who reached for the crown but was crushed by the throne he served. Both readings fed his legend, and audiences could choose which version they wanted to believe. Las Vegas leaned into the legend because Las Vegas always knew how to sell its past. The city thrives on image, on turning shadows into attractions. Tony's violence, once a liability, became part of the brand. Tourists could hear about the hole-in-the-wall gang while sipping cocktails, could visit the mob museum and stare at his mugshot before heading out to see Cirque du Soleil. The story of Anthony Spilotro became part of the city's dual identity. Glittering entertainment on the surface, blood-soaked history underneath. Chicago told it differently. On the West Side, older voices remembered him less as myth and more as neighborhood boy gone too far. Tony was tough, some would say, too tough for his own good. Others would mutter that he had embarrassed Chicago by drawing too much attention, that his recklessness in Vegas had weakened the outfit. For Chicago, his story was less a legend to sell than a warning to repeat. But nationally, and even internationally, Spilotro's name settled into the pantheon of mob lore. The Cornfield murder became one of the most infamous executions in organized crime history, retold in documentaries, dramatizations, and lectures. It was visceral, shocking, cinematic. Two brothers beaten to death, buried together, discovered by lawmen. It had the weight of Greek tragedy, blood brothers undone by loyalty and ambition. Hollywood, of course, had already sealed the deal with Casino. Pesci's Nicky Santoro burned Spilotro's image into global culture, the short, explosive enforcer with eyes like razors and a temper like dynamite. Every rewatch of the movie revived him. Every clip shared online carried his ghost further. And though some details were exaggerated, the bones of the story remained true. Audiences didn't care about the fine print. They cared about the shape of the tale: rise, violence, betrayal, fall. For Spilotro's family, this mythology was both unbearable and unshakable. They lived not with the symbol, but with the man. They knew the dinners, the arguments, the silences. They knew the father and husband behind the legend. Every retelling, every dramatization reminded them of what they had lost. Not a gangster, but flesh and blood. They could not escape his shadow, not in schools, not in neighborhoods, not even in private moments, because the world kept pulling him back onto screens and pages. Michael's family bore it with deeper bitterness. To them, the myth erased the injustice. Tony had chosen the life. Michael had not. Yet both ended in the same grave, both dragged into the same legend. Documentaries didn't dwell on Michael's reluctance, they focused on Tony's violence. To Michael's children, that imbalance cut deep. They remembered not myth, but a father taken because he stood too close to a brother who wouldn't change. Still, mythology rarely bends for truth. It bends for drama. And Tony's drama was irresistible. The larger meaning of his legacy lay in what it said about power. Spilotro showed that fear can lift a man quickly, but it cannot sustain him. Fear makes money flow, makes men obey, but it also breeds paranoia. He was feared in Las Vegas, but that fear isolated him. Friends became suspects, allies became enemies. Even his bosses, once dependent on him, grew weary of the noise his violence created. Fear, in the end, protected no one, not even the man who inspired it. He also represented the limits of loyalty in the mob. Tony demanded it, enforced it, punished its absence. But when the bosses decided he was a liability, loyalty vanished. The same organization he bled for, killed for, lived for, turned on him without hesitation. His cornfield grave was proof that in the outfit, loyalty was conditional, and survival was the only law. For American culture, his story played into the fascination with downfall. The public doesn't just want to see men rise, they want to see them fall. The bigger the ego, the harder the crash, the better the story. Spilotro embodied that. He walked into Las Vegas like he owned it, and he left it in a coffin. His end satisfied the narrative craving, the bully undone, the predator devoured, the ant crushed. And yet, The myth gives him a strange kind of immortality. He is remembered in ways far beyond his real importance. He wasn't a boss like Gotti. He wasn't a visionary like Luciano. He wasn't even the richest of mobsters. But his story stuck because it had all the elements: violence, betrayal, forbidden love, paranoia, and a brutal ending. He became larger than he ever was in life. Today, when people talk about Las Vegas's mob past, they talk about Tony. When the Mob Museum tells the story of organized crime, his name appears. When documentaries list the most infamous mob murders, the cornfield is always included. He has become part of the American myth of crime, alongside Capone's Tommy guns and Gotti's suits. That myth, like all myths, is double-edged. It fascinates, but it also warns. To some, Tony's life is proof of the power a man can seize with fists and fear. To others, it is proof of how quickly such power collapses. To his family, it is pain recycled endlessly. To Las Vegas, it is history monetized. To America, it is another chapter in the story it never tires of telling: the gangsters' rise and fall. Anthony Spilotro wanted to be remembered, and he is. But not as he hoped. Not as a boss, not as respected, not as untouchable. He is remembered as violent, reckless, betrayed. His immortality is real, but it is built on the spectacle of his downfall. And perhaps that is fitting for a man who spent his life chasing fear. In the end, his story proves that fear fades, but stories last. The story of Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro stretches across decades like a scar, beginning in the crowded neighborhoods of Chicago, running hot under the neon of Las Vegas, and ending beneath Indiana soil. To trace his life from boyhood fistfights to a cornfield grave is to watch the arc of ambition itself, its rise, its reckless expansion, and its collapse. By the time we reach the final reflection, with 40 years of hindsight, the pieces settle into clarity. What does Spilotro's life mean? What did his death signify? And why, after all this time, does his name still live on? In Chicago, he was one of 6 brothers, a short-tempered boy who didn't take to books or school but understood fists and fear. From the start, he seemed built for the streets, the kind of kid who believed rules were written for other people. He carried that defiance into manhood, and it became both his weapon and his downfall. Chicago's outfits spotted his talent for violence early, and in him they saw a tool, a young man who could be trusted to enforce debts, deliver beatings, and carry out punishments without hesitation. Tony understood that fear was a currency, and he spent it freely. When the outfit sent him to Las Vegas in the 1970s, it seemed a promotion, but it was also a test. The desert city was the mob's golden goose. Money skimmed off casinos flowing quietly back to Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland. Tony's job was simple: protect the flow, enforce loyalty, keep cheaters and thieves in line. And in those early years, he thrived. Tourists came for the lights and shows, but in the back rooms and hallways, the Ant's shadow made sure the rules were followed. But Tony was never content to be just an enforcer. He wanted more power, more respect, more control. He built the Hole in the Wall gang, a burglary crew that cut into homes and businesses with ruthless efficiency. He grew his side hustles: loan sharking, extortion, fencing stolen goods through his jewelry store. Each move fattened his pockets, but each move also drew attention. For a man who should have kept Vegas quiet, Tony made it noisy. The FBI listened, the newspapers wrote, and Chicago grew restless. The cracks spread fast. Frank Rosenthal, his partner in the casinos, grew to hate him, not just for his recklessness, but for the unforgivable sin of his affair with Rosenthal's wife. His marriage to Nancy fractured. His closest childhood friend, Frank Collada, flipped to the FBI after Bertha's burglary exposed the Hole in the Wall gang. With every betrayal, Tony grew more paranoid, more erratic, more violent. Fear had carried him far, but it began to turn inward, corroding his trust. By 1986, his bosses had enough. The outfit valued silence, discretion, profit. Tony brought heat, noise, and the FBI. He was no longer a soldier guarding the skim, he was a liability. The decision was made in whispers. The execution came in fists. He and his brother Michael walked into a house in Illinois believing they were headed for a meeting about promotion. They walked out as corpses, buried side by side in a cornfield. His death was brutal, but it was also inevitable. The mob had no retirement plan, no gold watch for years of service. When you outlived your usefulness, you were erased. Tony, who had spent his life enforcing loyalty with fear, was betrayed by the very system he served. His ending wasn't an accident of fate, it was the natural conclusion of the life he chose. And yet, his story didn't end in 1986. In many ways, it only began. The FBI and prosecutors turned his murder into a symbol, a case study in the ruthlessness of organized crime. Juries saw the photos, heard the testimony, and understood. This was what the outfit did, even to its own. His death became evidence. Las Vegas turned his memory into an attraction. The Mob Museum opened its doors, displaying his story alongside other infamous names. Tourists walked past his photographs, read about his hole-in-the-wall gang, and whispered about the cornfield. His life became part of the city's fabric, a reminder that the glittering strip was built not just on neon, but on shadows. Hollywood gave him immortality. Casino etched him into pop culture. Joe Pesci's Nicky Santoro terrifying audiences with a performance so violent, it made Spilotro's name known around the world. Every rewatch, every online clip, every meme about Santoro kept the ant alive. True crime media extended the legend. Documentaries, podcasts, YouTube videos, all retold his rise and fall, each layering myth over fact. Was he sadistic beyond measure? Was he simply reckless? Was he betrayed unfairly? The debates kept him alive, making him more famous in death than he ever was in life. But fame is not honor. Spilotro is remembered, yes, but not as he wanted. He craved respect, craved a seat at the boss's table. He believed fear could elevate him into power. Instead, he is remembered as reckless, paranoid, brutal. His legacy is not of a king, but of a cautionary tale. The man who thought fear made him untouchable, only to learn that the mob itself feared nothing except exposure. For his family, the legend is no comfort. They carry his name as a burden, not a crown. For his children, every documentary and dramatization reopens wounds. For Michael's family, the bitterness never fades. He was collateral, pulled into Tony's shadow and punished for blood ties. And yet, for the wider world, his story satisfies something deep. People are drawn to tales of rise and fall, of ambition that soars too high and collapses. Tony's story delivers all of it, the street kid rising to power, the violent enforcer ruling a city's shadows, the betrayals, the paranoia, the brutal ending. His arc is Shakespearean in its inevitability. That is why he endures. In the grand gallery of American gangsters, Spilotro's place is secure. Not as a visionary like Luciano, not as a boss like Gotti, not as an empire builder like Capone. He is remembered as muscle, as violence incarnate, as the enforcer who reached too far. His cornfield grave is as famous as Capone's prison cell, Gotti's courtroom, or Bugsy Siegel's Beverly Hills bullet. So what does it mean, in the end? What is the lesson of Tony the Ant? It means that fear cannot buy immortality. It means that loyalty in the mob is a mirage, shifting with the winds of profit and risk. It means that ambition without control leads not to power, but to destruction. It means that men who rule by fists often fall under them. For Las Vegas, it means the city's glamorous surface will always hide a darker truth, that the glitter was built on shadows, and those shadows had names like Spilotro. For Chicago, it means the outfit's history is written not just in money and politics, but in betrayals and graves. For America, it means the gangster remains one of its most enduring myths, a figure of power, greed, and inevitable downfall. And for Tony himself, he got what he always wanted. He is remembered. His name, his story, his death, They live on in books, films, museums, conversations. He is immortal, not as a boss, not as respected, not as untouchable, but as a legend of violence and fall. His immortality is twisted, but it is real. The ant crawled out of Chicago's alleys, marched through Vegas's neon, and was crushed in Indiana dirt. And yet, in every whisper about the old days, in every screening of Casino, in every tourist tour of mob history, he crawls again, smaller than he thought, but larger than life.